What is the best car to use in Asseto Corsa Competizione for a complete beginner in 2024? Well, as a complete beginner in the game, I needed to answer this question for myself. So I thought I would run an experiment for some science to not only work out what is the best starting car for me, but to give you the perspective from a complete beginner of what could be the best car for you as well. So in this video, I'm going to break down the process I took for this experiment, as well as all the results and observations for each car. And stick around to the end because I have one interesting discussion point that could be the most important factor for some new sim racers. All set? Let's dive in. So let's start our experiment with a question. Why do you need to choose just one car when starting out in ACC? Well, the answer is simple. ACC is a simulation. It's trying to be as close as possible to the real thing. And as a result, you are left with a really complex game. There are loads of tracks, loads of variation in weather, dynamic race situations, and a full array of vehicle setup adjustments. Then to top it off, you have the full spectrum of GT3 cars, which handle and behave differently based on their inherent design. So, as a beginner in ACC, you want to shorten the learning curve by choosing just one car, getting to understand its characteristics and how it's set up, before then diving in and being able to learn the rest of the complexities in the game and ultimately get faster, more consistent, and perform better in races in a shorter period of time. Right, and now let's lay out the process, the experiment. This is where you can take some notes at home if you're interested in trying this for yourself, and I highly recommend it. But if you're not interested in the process, you can skip to the results in the timeline and go straight there. First, you want to get comfortable in the game. Do a bunch of hours, drive a bunch of cars. You don't want to be changing your field of view or changing your wheel settings during the test. So get comfortable with the game, go through all that setup, and you're ready to go. Next, choose a track with a bunch of features. I've chosen Imola. Imola's got some high speed and low speed corners. It's got some high curbing, which more on that later, and it also has some really hard braking zones as well. So it has the sort of spectrum that you might see in circuits. You also want to complete your sessions in hot lap mode, and that just takes out any weather and time variations during your test. Next, pick your cars. In this test, I will be testing the current generation GT3 cars. And the reason is that just in the real world, the older cars are slower. Progress only moves forward, and every new generation GT3 car is faster than its previous. So it does mean there are a lot of cars in the game that aren't going to get any love, but with a personal goal of getting involved with LFM, getting a license and getting racing in that community, you do not want to be hindering yourself by choosing a car that's just slower. And lastly, you want to have some basic setup knowledge. For me, I'll be using the aggressive preset, setting tire pressures, using brakes 1, and using the aerodynamics tab. I've quickly found that ride height adjustments and wing angles make a big difference to how the car handles, and I've become familiar with it at my skill level. But make sure you do what you are comfortable with. So with the setup out of the way, we're now ready to cut some laps. Start by doing a few laps in each car and working out an initial base setup. Get your pressures right, get comfortable with how the car is, make some early adjustments. And then from there, go out and do a few sessions of at least 10 laps each, rotating through those cars. This is where the grind comes in. But there's a few things you want to take note when doing those sessions. How quickly you get up to speed, how consistent you can be, or more, how often you don't crash, and outright pace. I found that with each car, I kind of got to a natural plateau, and sometimes that was in a few laps, sometimes it took longer. But ultimately, the main goal is that for each car, you come away with a clear understanding or a clear opinion on how that car handles and how it suits you and your natural driving style. I think it's important that as a first time or a beginner sim racer or just new to the game, you're going to have a natural ability for the game, and certain cars are simply going to be better for you. Now, to be clear, this certainly took me a number of nights in the sim rig to complete. It's all good practice, but make sure you spend the time getting it right. Now, time for the all-important results and observations. I'm going to go through these cars in no particular ranked order, and obviously they're simply my feelings with each car based on being a complete beginner. But I will show you the fastest lap times as we go through this list. If you are interested in how I would rank these cars, then please, after this video, link in description to these two videos here where I talk about my top 4 and bottom 4 cars from this test. First off, the Nissan GT-R Nismo GT3. A slow car until it wasn't. I was well into stints with this car and only been able to produce 1 minute 45 second lap times, which for me is slow based on the results I got from this test. But made a couple of small ride height changes and the car really came into its own. In the end, I ended up with a best time of 1 minute 44.067. I feel like this car would be a tricky car to set up for being fast, but it overall is a very safe car to drive. But struggling to find pace easily in this car does make me wonder how easily this car would keep up with pace as my driver skill improves as well. Second car to chat about is the Mercedes-AMG GT3. Again, has similar attributes to the Nissan, being a front engine car. It's got some natural understeer and ultimately just requires a bit of patience through the mid-corner to deal with. But this understeer does make the first part of the corner nice and safe, so you feel like you can push it a little bit without being too nervous or spinning out mid-corner. The exits can be a little bit wild in this car, but overall it is a nice safe car to drive. However, the car does feel like a bit of a boat. It's a big heavy car and you certainly feel it. A 1 minute 44 second 0.145 as a best lap time, and honestly never really felt like going into the 143s in this car. So solid car, but potentially not the quickest car out there. The third car on this list is a quick conversation about the Bentley Continental GT3. It's a very similar story to the Mercedes, where it's big and feels a bit like a boat and feels a little bit sluggish. It's also the only car that I tested that's right-hand drive, sitting on the other side of the car. So it certainly took a few laps to work out where the car sat and the lines and bits and pieces. It's quite a change actually. So it would mean that if you were to change from this car at a later date, there would be that learning process as well. But a 144.147 puts it almost exactly the same as the Mercedes in this test. Car number 4, the Honda NSX GT3 Evo. This car didn't get me super excited in this test. Really did struggle to find a sweet spot with any sort of setup, and it was a really nervous car into and in the middle of a corner. It really didn't like curbs, which I found to be a bit of a trait with a mid-engine car in this game, and I only managed to do a mid 144 second lap, so ended up being one of the slowest cars from a best time in the test. I had plenty of off-track moments in this car as well, so for me this car really just didn't work naturally. Speaking of loose cars, let's now talk about the Ford Mustang GT3, the newest car in the game. This car is wild. It's got big power and big torque, so it can really monster the straights, and it's really good on the brakes. Be patient in the mid-corner and then get ready to hold on out the other side. It can be very, very loose, and it would be worth dialing up the traction control a few clicks to get that under control. But although it's wild, I really enjoyed driving this car. It's great over the curbs, and because it's good under brakes, it gives you a lot of confidence. A 1 minute 44.045 second lap means it's pretty quick, and there's definitely more lap time in this car. I think when you drive it, you'll quickly work out whether it suits your driving style or not, or whether you simply like it enough to try and overcome some of those characteristics, but certainly not the easiest car to drive out of the box for a beginner. Sixth car on the list is the Lexus RSF GT3, another fast car down the straight. This car did a lot of things really well, and I was able to produce quite a bit of consistency in this car. A best lap time of 1:44.042. But two things to note about this car. It has quite a terrible blind spot in the A pillar, and it made finding apexes, particularly at the hairpin and the chicane, a little bit tricky. It's also the only car I tested that's actually not on the LFM balance of performance list. Now, I'm not sure exactly why it's not on this list, as it seems like the speed is quite comparable to a lot of other new gen cars, but I would be doing some research about that, as potentially this car gets left behind a bit with balance of performance. Potentially it's not that competitive, but to be honest, I'm not really sure. Worth doing your research if you want to use this car long term. Halfway now, and the next car we're going to talk about is the Lamborghini Huracan GT3 Evo. A couple of the mid-engine cars I did get along with, and this was one of them. I really like the way this car gets into a corner, really good on initial turn-in. It's not nervous in the mid-corner like the Honda was, but it can be a little bit twitchy on exit acceleration, but I didn't find it too hard to control. Best time was a 1:44.185, but there were a lot of laps close to that, so it had really good consistency for me. Number 8 on the talking list is the McLaren 720S GT3 Evo. If I'm honest, I had really big expectations for this car, and it took a little while for them to actually eventuate. I really struggled with mid-corner oversteer with this car, and it made the car really nervous to drive. This car also hates curbs, so the chicane at Imola was a nightmare to try and get right. And overall, I had to do a lot more laps in this car to start feeling comfortable and produce a more competitive lap time. But eventually, I did find with setup, you run the car really low with lots of wing and dial up the traction control a little bit, the car really came alive. A best lap time of 1:43.695 made it one of the fastest cars in the game, and also the consistency under 44 seconds was there as well. It was really surprising just how those small tweaks gained nearly a second in overall lap time for me, and it did make me wonder a little bit about how easy this car could be to set up on other tracks. If you get your head around it, it's certainly a fast car, no one's complaining at the speed of it, and it was easy to drive once set up. But potentially a little bit more work than some of these cars to get it right out of the box. From fast to slow, ninth car on the list, the Audi R8 Evo 2. This car felt okay, but no matter how hard I pushed it, I really struggled to get faster lap times. There's nothing inherently wrong with the car. It was really stable, it got into a corner well, it was actually quite easy to drive, it just never produced any real pace. I did manage a 1:44.277, but honestly it was kind of a one-off, and I never really replicated it on a consistent basis. So, just like Audi are sort of ditching their customer support for GT3 cars in the real world, it feels like this car is sort of following suit in the game for some reason. Home stretch now, the BMW M4 GT3. A strong car with less understeer than some of the other front engine cars in the game. It's good under brakes, but it can get a little bit tail happy on corner exit. The main thing with this car is the gear ratios are slightly different compared to most other cars in the game, and I recommend experimenting with some slightly different gears in corners when you're driving these cars back to back. Overall, I feel this has the strongest pace of any of the front engine cars in the game, and it showed it off really well here with the fastest lap of the test, a 1:43.557. The 11th and last front engine car to talk about is the Aston Martin V8 Vantage GT3. What a safe car, but gotta be patient with this car. Yes, you can attack the curbs, but you've got to be earlier on the brakes and patient through the mid-corner to really hit that apex. And then out the other side, very, very safe under acceleration. Personally, I really had to take a number of laps to sort of teach this patience to myself. I found myself out-braking myself, missing mid-corner apexes quite a lot, and ultimately a best lap time of 1:44.222. However, there were a lot of laps that were much quicker that were just invalidated on running a little bit over curb, a little bit of track limit. So it requires a very patient driving style, but certainly the lap times are there to be one of the quickest cars for a beginner. 2 to go now, and let's chat about the Ferrari 296 GT3. Really good on its brakes and really good on the initial turn-in, allowing to be nice and accurate to the apex. A little bit more rear ride height allowed the car to rotate really well in the mid-corner, and out the other side, at the acceleration phase, it was really manageable. A big plus for this mid-engine car is it's much nicer over the curbs than something, say, like the McLaren. Definitely not as good as the front-engine cars, but it was certainly nice to be able to take a bit more curb and not get completely fired off circuit. Fastest lap time was identical to the McLaren, a 1:43.695, but a lot of laps in the 43s, bit more consistent with this car compared to the McLaren, and overall really, really nice car to drive. And last, and potentially the most interesting car to talk about in Asseto Corsa Competizione, is the Porsche 992 GT3R. This for me was a big surprise of a car because I was expecting it to be nearly impossible to drive. And in a way it was. Initially with aggressive preset, very basic, it was really, really tricky both into and out of a corner. It did things that other cars don't do, and it really was hard to get my head around how to drive it. But I found that with some setup changes, which are probably more a fluke than anything, the car settled down and it was really fast and good to drive. I managed to drive a 1:43.615, making it nearly the fastest car in test, and overall was really happy with that particular lap. But it is very clear that this car would be very tricky to set up. And even though it's one of the coolest cars in the game and it sounds amazing and so many people love the Porsche, I would be really worried as a beginner that this would be a long, hard road to make this car work on all the tracks, all the weather conditions, and all the situations that you're going to be thrown into. So keep it in mind. I'm sure if you're willing and able, you can make this work even as a beginner, but it would be certainly one of the trickiest cars to get right consistently, and there might be a lot of heartache involved in that. And a final wrap up of all of the top 13 best lap results. We've got the BMW on top with that 1:43.557 lap time, followed by the Porsche on its fluke setup, and closely followed again by the Ferrari and the McLaren, which were very similar cars. And then a big group of front engine cars from the Lexus down to the Bentley, all within 1.5 tenths. The Lamborghini follows up next, and the Aston Martin in 11th is probably the car that isn't represented fairly on this list, in my opinion. My two slowest cars, the Audi and the Honda, rounding out a full second behind the BMW's time. So to conclude this experiment, I certainly want to make the point that I feel that this has been a really good insight for me to understand these cars in game and understand all of their inherent traits. I've learned a lot about these cars and learned a lot about myself and my driving style and what suits that in ACC. But I wanted to talk about one major point that I have not put into this test that could be the most important factor for you when you make the decision of what car you want to use in the game going forward. And that is, do you have a favorite car, manufacturer, team, driver, something from the real world that got you excited to get into this hobby to start with? Because despite what you find in your test, you might not like that brand in real life. And that is 100% okay. It's good that there's outside influences that got us into this hobby to start with. And sure, if the car you really like that you want to drive in game is actually the slowest for you, then you'll have to take it that it will be a longer journey to find pace and to learn that car and to learn its setups. But overall, it's about getting the best experience in the sim for you. And if that's a particular car you've got your mind set on, then go for it, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, enjoyment is all it's about, and the performance will come later. So please make sure that that is the biggest part of your decision making process. So there we have it, discussion points on 13 of the fastest cars in ACC as tested by a complete beginner. I really hope you got some great insights from this video, and let me know in the comments if you've got any further information. Let's make this a cool video that new sim racers can come and learn about these cars in the game. If you want to follow me in my ACC journey, there'll be so much more coming up, lots of beginner perspective of the game as I do it. So please subscribe, follow along this cool journey. That's all from me. Race hard, stay positive, and we'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.